Hello again. First of all, a big thank you to my subscribers. There are 521 of you. And a huge welcome to new subscribers. The Practical Animal channel is dedicated to the public understanding of the animal industry. Join me on a round-the-world survey of careers with wildlife. The channel aims to give students and career breakers tips that may just give you the edge you need to land that dream animal job. To meet today's guest, we go to Canada. Dr. Brooke Biddlecombe is a science specialist in the Canadian government's Polar Bear Research Group, also a TED speaker and an expert on the species in the wild. She talks to me today about the conservation of the polar bear across its 19 subpopulations. There are an estimated 20 to 25,000 polar bears in the wild. 2/3 of the whole population exist in Canada. For students of English as a foreign language, this video will be interesting because you will hear two distinct accents. My British one and Dr. Biddlecombe's Canadian accent. Working with polar bears and living the wildlife looks like this.
Brooke, have you ever been bitten by a polar bear?
I have not been bitten by a polar bear, ever, thankfully.
Brooke, what's your best polar bear fact, please?
I mean, there are a lot of good polar bear facts, but I think my best one is that when polar bears are born, they only weigh just under 2 pounds. And in the course of a year, they'll get up to about 100 pounds. And by full grown, they're all the way up to as big as 1,200 pounds. So from 2 to 1,200 pounds.
What is the natural range of polar bears, Brooke?
So polar bears are what we call circumpolar, which basically means they exist kind of around the entire Arctic. So they exist in 5 countries: Canada, the United States, Russia, Norway, and Greenland, which is Denmark. And 2/3 of the polar bears on the planet actually exist in Canada.
Really? Why is that? Any particular reason?
So Canada, I mean, it has quite a lot of landmass up there in the Arctic, and a lot of coastline. Polar bears really like coastline. They like coastline that has sea ice. And the Canadian Arctic is a bunch of islands that have a lot of ice and a lot of coastline. So it's great polar bear habitat up there.
Are they being affected by climate change, Brooke?
Yes. There has been research as far back as 1995 that suggests that even back then, polar bears were being affected by climate change. And of course, in the past 30-ish years, the evidence is just getting stronger and stronger. Kind of the biggest threat is that loss of habitat, aka the loss of sea ice, from climate warming that's happening kind of across a lot of the Arctic.
Wow. Brooke, what jobs are there with polar bears?
So there's a diversity of polar bear jobs, kind of depending on what you're interested in. There are, of course, researchers, and I have some colleagues that study polar bears and work at universities. I myself work in the Canadian government studying polar bears. There are also provincial government. The government of Nunavut, for example, has folks that work on polar bears. There are also non-for-profits or non-governmental organizations. A big one that I'm an ambassador for is Polar Bears International. They do a lot of really great work for polar bears. There's also zoos. So there are a number of zoos that have polar bears in them, so kind of like the zookeeper role, but also a number of zoos fund polar bear research. So I also have colleagues that work at zoos, but do kind of research in the field on polar bears as well. And of course, tourism. So there are a number of places you can go and view polar bears. Kind of a really big one is Churchill, Manitoba, Canada, the polar bear capital of the world, as we fondly call it. And kind of they have a period every year where the polar bears are migrating kind of past Churchill. So tourism is booming. And so we have like buggy drivers and people that do tours and all that good stuff too.
Fantastic. Brooke, how would you describe polar bear conservation in Canada today?
So it's been like this for a while, but polar bears are definitely a conservation concern in Canada. They're an important species for Canadian culture, especially Canadian culture for people that live in the Canadian North. They're very important culturally, economically. Polar bears, they're big, they're remote, they're moderately hard to study. So there's always kind of more work that we can do, better ways that we can try and get more information. We're always looking for more information to kind of find the best possible ways to make decisions that affect their conservation and their management.
Brooke, what questions regarding polar bear conservation would you like to see answered during the next 30 years?
There are 19 polar bear subpopulations across the Circumpolar Arctic. Not a ton of those are actually super well studied. We know a lot about some of them, but some of these populations are what we call data deficient. So we still just don't really know a ton. Like it's hard for us to even know even the population abundance in some of these populations because they're so difficult to access and so difficult to study. So I would really like to see, you know, as we kind of technologically progress and find better ways to collect data, I would love to kind of even out the knowledge base for all of these different populations.
In Canada, Brooke, what is the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, status of polar bears? Are they vulnerable? Are they critically endangered? What is it?
So Canada-wide, polar bears are a special concern. We cannot classify them as threatened or endangered yet because some populations are doing well, some are even increasing, some of course are decreasing. So as a whole, special concern, but we do have a decent amount of focus on conservation, even though they don't have that threatened status.
Brooke, can you describe your work, please?
Yeah, so I've hopped around a little bit, but my work on polar bears currently, I work for the Canadian government in the polar bear research group. So I am a science specialist, they call me. But we do a lot of stuff. But basically the idea is our group really focuses on collecting as much data as we can and understanding as many facets of polar bear ecology as we can and how that is then applied to optimal conservation decisions and optimal management decisions, because polar bears still are managed as a harvested species because Inuit people in the Canadian North harvest polar bears still for food, clothing, economy, etc. So we're conserving and managing with all the information we can possibly gather, basically.
Brooke, what skills and personal qualities does a person need to work in the field with polar bears to do what you're doing?
Yeah, so your question in the field can have two very different angles. So in the field of polar bear research, right, like I spend a lot of my time working at a desk doing data analysis. I do a lot of math. And I think a big skill, even if you just want to be involved in polar bear conservation at all, is passion, right? If a genuine interest in the species, in the field, in the Arctic even. I personally think that'll get you farthest, is having a passion for it. But if we look at another angle of this question, in the field, as in, right, we go into the field, as in go up to the Arctic and work with the bears doing field work, as we call it in biology. So in that case, right, so if you want to, work on polar bear conservation, passion's good. If you want to work in the field on the bears, on the ice or the ground, it's a really good skill set to be kind of level-headed, resourceful. If there's one thing I know about working in the Arctic, it's that things will go wrong. Things always go wrong. So resourcefulness is very good, being adaptive, and a big one is staying calm in not calm situations. So like I've been in the field and we've had surprise bear interactions, or a bear that decided to come check out our camp. Does not help to freak out in those situations. It helps to stay level-headed. And, when you learn what to do, it helps to be able to actually do that in the situation.
I love that. Gosh, the mind boggles. I wonder what, can you describe some of the unanticipated interactions you've had?
Yeah, so this past summer, I was actually working on whales, but also bears. We're at a field camp up in the Canadian high Arctic, and we just had this young, curious bear who, we're just a bunch of people in a bunch of tents on the tundra. We're new. So this bear was very interested in coming to check out our camp. And so when we're in a field camp, we have bear watch. So people sleep and people stay awake and watch for bears. So when a bear comes near camp, everyone gets woken up and kind of shaken out of their tents. We always, no matter where you are in the Arctic, what kind of field work you're doing, you should always have a firearm, because that's sort of your last method of defense. Luckily, I've not had to use one. But in this case, we kind of tried some tactics to scare away a bear. I know polar bears, they're big, they're scary. Do be scared of them if you see them in the wild, but they can get spooked. So we had a big fuel drum. So we're banging on our fuel drum, just trying to be loud, right? To spook this young bear. Didn't work. This bear was very curious. So kind of the next step was to do warning shots, basically. So we shoot the shotgun straight up and just the loud noise, kind of like a bear banger, but we don't have bear bangers on us just because, sometimes they don't work. So we did a couple warning shots, and that got the bear to walk on down the coast a bit. And for the most part, didn't come back. Would kind of, come nearby, but a couple warning shots were okay, they're spooky. I'm gonna stay away.
Can you describe a little bit about, if it's not a taboo subject, the firearms that you have to carry? Do interns or students go with you into the field? Do they need to learn how to use a firearm? What caliber is it? How does it work?
Yeah, so back when I was a student, before I ever went into the field to do polar bear field work, I did have to get a possession and acquisition license. In theory, you can maybe go into the field without one, but it's very useful for everyone in the field to be trained on a firearm because you never really know. And we always use a shotgun, nothing else. Some people prefer other firearms, but shotguns, they just kind of, they're more robust, easy to handle, easier to aim, I guess. And yeah, we always have 2 usually on us, and everyone is both trained with a possession and acquisition license, and also we do live fire training. So you actually know how to discharge the fire, which is useful.
Brooke, what should interns wear for an interview to be involved in the work that you do?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question for me, because one of the things I really like about working in science is there's not that much focus on how you dress. right? It's more about your skill set. That being said, I think wearing something, like comfortable, but like presentable, right? Don't wear your pajamas. But like, for example, you'll catch most of us like field scientists in like a fleece and cargo pants most of the time. But
Brooke, what are good questions that interns can ask at interview?
yeah, so I think this will really vary depending on where you're interviewing, right? Are you interviewing at a zoo, a non-for-profit, volunteering in a lab? So I think generally speaking, the best thing is to ask questions that show that you have researched the organization and researched the subject matter, aka polar bears. If you take the time to show that you have like a base knowledge in what the organization is doing and Arctic ecology, that's a really good way to show that you're passionate. Again, coming back to that, questions that show you're passionate, show you have a knowledge base. I think that's very, very useful.
Brooke, where do our knowledge gaps lie in polar bear conservation?
A current knowledge gap that we're pretty interested in is cub survival, right? Because the population can't really grow if our cubs are not surviving. And so we don't have this idea of like, okay, when does cub mortality occur? What affects cub mortality? And by mortality, I just mean death, right? So when does this occur? Why does this occur? Things like that are a big interest to my research group right now. Another one, of course, is, like I mentioned, abundance estimation. So we have an idea of how many bears there are globally and in each of these different subpopulations, but some of these estimates they're not great. So working on ways to get better abundance estimation is really good. And one more knowledge gap that I am particularly interested in right now is kind of the interplay between different stressors, right? So we have sea ice loss, but we also have the presence of contaminants or parasites or different diseases that are becoming more prevalent in polar bears right now. And also maybe some anthropogenic effects, like we have more shipping through the Arctic in recent years, a little bit more oil and gas development, things like that. So it's how do these different stressors work together to affect bears rather than just each on their own?
How did your career develop?
So back when I was an undergraduate student, I took a course called Northern Ecology by a professor named Dr. Andrew DeRoche. Andrew DeRoche is a leading scientist in polar bear research in Canada out of the University of Alberta, which is where I was. I loved his course, so I approached him to ask if I could do an undergraduate research project with him. To my delight, he agreed. So I did an undergraduate research project on polar bear mating with Dr. DeRoche. And then I stuck with him and did my master's degree, also at the University of Alberta, on polar bear movement ecology. From then, I actually switched gears a little bit, and through some networking, some connections, being in grad school, you kind of make connections with people in a similar field. So through that, I took on a PhD project at the University of Manitoba, where I was working still in the Arctic, but on whales this time. And kind of throughout my work on whales, I really stayed very connected to the polar bear community. And then after I finished my PhD, I was offered a job with the Canadian government back working on bears again. So kind of a big thing is networking, meeting people. Yeah, it's very helpful to put yourself out there.
Brooke, would you say that having a master's degree in wildlife biology or an allied discipline is so much more impactful on your career than simply settling for a first degree, a bachelor's degree?
I think in the wildlife ecology, biology field, I really think it is. I have a great deal of contacts, of course, from grad school, not that work on polar bears, but having a master's degree really kind of shows, one, it shows your commitment to the field. And I think two, a big thing that people kind of appreciate about people that have master's degrees is you learn sort of how to do independent research, right? Like with a research-based master's degree, you learn how to basically conduct your own research project. And that's so valuable when you want to get a job doing field research, right? Because then you're thinking, right? I'm in the field. What kind of data should I collect depending on what I want to find out? Like you learn to understand what the data I should get is, how I should analyze it, what am I trying to answer? And master's degrees, I think, do a really good job of teaching students how to do that quite well.
So on a similar subject, Brooke, please can you suggest a research project for a student?
So for an undergraduate student?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think a big thing to keep in mind for an undergraduate research project is to keep it relatively simple, right? This isn't a master's degree. Most students that do undergraduate research are also doing other courses. That's very much what I was doing. So don't bite off more than you can chew. That's a good one. But if a student is really interested in looking at polar bear related questions, some good ones right now would be maybe looking at contaminants or pathogens in polar bear tissue samples. So we can look at contaminants in hair, for example, or fat. And oftentimes, if that's sort of the project interest, that data is already available where you can collaborate with another group that has collected that data. We're always keen to get our data analyzed. So that's kind of, a good, like simple, like, okay, let me analyze these samples that already exist, because then you're not relying on like the very stressful timing of having to collect your own data while being an undergraduate student as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Brooke, is there any other advice you can give to somebody who wants to be wants to be a polar bear researcher?
I think a big one is, well, like I said, passion is important. When I started my academic journey, I wanted to study something else, but I kind of followed my curiosity and kind of discovered what I was passionate about. So my advice is, if you really think like polar bears is it, let yourself maybe explore some other avenues. But if polar bears is it, something to keep in mind, polar bear research is highly collaborative. So meeting people, being willing to work with other people, great. Very good way to go about things. Because there's lots and lots of people involved. Also, something that is important to keep in mind for anyone who's interested in working on polar bears. Polar bears are what we call charismatic megafauna. They're big animals that people really love. And that's exactly it. People really love polar bears. So if you're planning to work on polar bears, expect a lot of interest, expect a lot of opinions, and expect a lot of emotions involved, because people, they care a lot about them, which is amazing. We love that. But sometimes it can be challenging to get so many opinions at the same time. And finally, what I tell all my students and all that, curiosity is king, right? Find out what you're curious about and let it lead you. That's what I did.
Now, I have to make sure I've got my details right for the vote of thanks, because what I've written is, Brooke, you are an aquatic biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada.
I used to be.
What are you now? How can I correct that? Brooke,
Oh,
you are
I am a physical sciences specialist with Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have put it better myself. So, thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal Channel, Dr. Brooke Biddlecombe.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
So did I.